Okay. So my second lecture today is on transducers, actually on how to set up your ultrasound machine. I think most important thing is the orientation, your orientation with that ultrasound probe and what you see in front of you, and which knobs you can use for optimal imaging. So we will talk a little bit. We might repeat some of the things that I've said in the previous lecture, but we're going to talk about the basic components of the ultrasound probe. What is the correct orientation when you're scanning transabdominally? What is the correct orientation when you're scanning transvaginally? And which controls should you use to maximize your quality of your image? Now, some ultrasound probes, when you work in a unit, you can walk up to the machine and there are 5 different probes there because maybe you're sharing the machine with the radiology department. But the 3 probes we mostly use, of course, are either for transabdominal scanning or transvaginal scanning. And for transabdominal scanning, I don't think there are many people that use a linear probe anymore. So the linear probe is a straight probe, and it's really useful when you're doing Doppler with very high velocities. But for obstetric scanning, we mostly use a curvy linear probe. And the reason we use that is because the maternal abdomen is quite large in pregnancy, and you need a large scanning probe to scan over the maternal abdomen. For transvaginal scanning, we use an endocaviteel, curvy, linear, or annular probe. Now, when we compare transabdominal scanning to transvaginal scanning, there are some advantages to some of the probes over the others. For instance, with transabdominal scanning, we usually use a 3.5 to 5 megahertz probe, whereas with transvaginal scanning, we use much higher frequency probes, about a 5 to 9.5 megahertz probe. And of course, I've already told you that high frequency probes give you better resolution, and that is why with transvaginal scanning, you get better resolution than transabdominal scanning, especially in the first trimester. The disadvantage to transvaginal scanning is that your field of view is limited. So you can't scan very wide, whereas with transabdominal scanning, your field of view is larger, but your structures need to be further than 4 centimeters away from your transducer, and that doesn't help with transvaginal scanning, especially maybe if you're doing nuchal translucency scanning, which is not part of this course, but just as a point of illustration. Sometimes I scan a fetus that's 13 weeks and 6 days in a really obese woman, and then the baby's in a breech position, and then the head is very far away from you because already the crown rump length at 13 weeks is 7 centimeters, and the field is 4 centimeters. So when the baby's breech, it's further away. You don't actually get to see that well. But there are challenges when scanning abdominally, and one of the challenges is a really full maternal bladder, bowel, and BMI, or distance from the probe. Whereas the BMI is of a lesser extent with transvaginal scanning, and bowel gas to a lesser extent. When scanning transvaginally, hygiene is very important. I always clean the probe before I do a transvaginal scan. Then I put gel on the tip of the probe, and then I cover it with a condom, preferably latex-free. And when I'm finished, then I clean the probe again before I put it back into the holder. And just to show you what I mean, when you compare transabdominal scanning to transvaginal scanning, this is a fetus in the first trimester. And you can see reasonably well. I mean, you can measure from there to there, the crown to rump length. But this fetus is the same fetus as this one, and look how much clearer you see the detail. You can see the back of the skull better. You can actually see the spine. You can actually place your markers far more accurately. Here is a trans-abdominal scan, and you can see this is the fetal abdomen, but something over here doesn't look right. This is actually an omphalocele, but look how much better you see the same omphalocele by scanning transvaginally. And we know that an omphalocele is associated with things like trisomy 18, so we would really like to see the baby's anatomy even better, and that's why we would look for other things and scan transvaginally to obtain better views of the hands and the cord and the heart and the face. Now, what probe should you select for what examination? Well, definitely in the first trimester between 5 and 8 weeks, doesn't matter how slim your patient is, it's going to be very difficult to see whether the baby's heart is beating when you scan transabdominally at a gestational age of 6 weeks. So transvaginal is the way to go because you're using the high frequency transducer and you'll have high resolution. Between 8 and 13 weeks, we use transabdominal route for scanning, and we use high frequency to get better resolution. But these days you have something called multi-frequency probes, or the 3D probes. Now, multi-frequency probes has many frequencies in one transducer, and that means you have resolution, good resolution, and penetration. And on your ultrasound machine, if you're scanning with a multi-frequency probe, you need to ask the technician where, if every ultrasound company calls the frequency, where you change the frequency a different name. Some of them call it high definition, some of them call it frequency. Ask them, where do you change the frequency on that transabdominal probe if you've got a multi-frequency probe so that you can set it higher or lower. Okay. In the second trimester, we also use transabdominal route for scanning. And in the third trimester, we'd use a lower frequency sound. Why? Because the baby is a lot bigger and we want to see further down. There are 2 other times we might use transvaginal scanning in the second and the third, late second trimester and third trimester, and that is to locate the placenta and to look for things like vasa previa if it's low, or to measure cervical length. So now you've decided what transducer to use. Now you need to look at your patient. So for patients who have a BMI of under 24, a 5 megahertz probe should be fine. But for patients who have BMIs of higher than 25, and we get patients who weigh more than what they are tall, with BMIs of 50, a lower frequency probe would be better, but you're never going to see that well. And this brings me into, as Katja said, the minefield of the buttons on your ultrasound machine. And each ultrasound machine, there are many different companies that have these buttons in different places. But I will be talking about the most important buttons that you should find on your ultrasound machine, and take a note of their names, and when you are with your ultrasound machine and the representative from the ultrasound company is with you, ask them, where are these buttons on my machine? So I think the first one to say something about is the on-off button. It sounds really stupid, but I have walked into a place which wasn't an ultrasound machine that I knew, and probably spent about 10 minutes looking for the on-off button. When it found it, it was actually at the back of the machine, right down the bottom where the cable of the machine goes into the plug. So you can look really silly if you don't know where the on-off button of the machine is. But I think I want to start with the power button, which is something not many people actually think about, and that is the energy that you transmit into the patient. There is a power button on your machine, and you shouldn't turn the power button on to be at 100% power. You should scan at about 75% of the power. And Patients that are slim, you can turn it down even lower. We did mention something about depth and zoom. And when I see the registrars in the beginning learning to scan, they always think they see better when they look at structures that are very tiny and very far away, right in the top of the screen, and they forget about this whole area here where there's nothing. So the first button when you start scanning is to enlarge the image you're looking at. Use the depth button, bring that femur into the middle of your screen. Fill that screen with that femur, and then there's a little box usually called the zoom button where you can actually zoom into that femur without actually losing resolution. So fill the screen with whatever it is you're wanting to measure. Forget about the bladder and the kidneys and the arms and the legs. When you're measuring and make that femur or that humerus or that BPD fill at least 2/3 of your screen. Focus, another button that people actually forget about. And the focus button is really like comparing it to the lens of your camera. So the closer the structure you're looking at is to the transducer, you get curving of the ultrasound beams, and there's a delay in the transmission of sound to the probe. And this results in less resolution, whereas if it's further away, then there's less delay. And this is extremely important when you're doing ultrasound-guided procedures. And yesterday I had to do an amnio, and I actually, to my shame, actually for the first time in a long time, looked at that focus button, actually moved it up, and hey, I actually saw the needle a lot better than I'd actually seen it before. So move move it into the area you want to be working in and looking at. So here you can see, and where is that focus button? So when you look on your ultrasound machine, there's a little arrow on the side, this little arrow. So if you're wanting to look at the baby's lips, look here, the ultrasound beams are focused in this area, but that's not the point of interest. The point of interest is here. So you need to move the focus buttons down so that you can see the structures of the lip. The gain. The gain is really like the amplifier in your sound system. And gain amplifies the sound and also artifacts. So the gain is set correctly when fluid is black and bone is white. So this picture over here, the sound, there's two white, the picture on the left. So you can see the gain is too high, but this is much better because bone is white and fluid is black. The sector width, we spoke a little bit about that. When you're looking at a large structure like the abdominal circumference to measure, you need a wide sector width to measure the abdominal circumference. But if you look at the picture on the right, we're wanting to examine the baby's heart. Only the heart, not the lungs, not the ribs. So bring down the field of view. And this will improve the resolution of the moving structure you wanted to examine, being the fetal heart. This is another one of my favorites. When I walk up to the ultrasound machine after somebody else has been there, or when I come to Tygerberg on a Monday and look at the ultrasound machine and I can see those little paddles at the top there. They shifted all over the place. And the time gain compensation is so important. Those little paddles represent the near, the middle, and the far field. So the near, the middle, and the far field. I'm I've just realized that the pointer is not on. So the middle, the near, the middle, and the far gain. So the picture in the middle, you can see there's uniform gain throughout that whole image. The picture on the left, you can see closest to the footprint is quite dark. And that is because the time gain compensation in the near field is set too far to the left. And that's why it's black. And the one on the right, there's excessive gain in the far field. So those little paddles have been moved all the way to the right. I'm sorry, to the left in the top and to the right in the third image on your right. So those little paddles in the middle have to all be sort of down the middle to give you uniform gain. The cine loop, that's one of the most important things on your ultrasound machine. So when you hit the freeze button, it captures a clip. Some of them can record up to a minute. Others are shorter, depends on how it's been set up on your machine. But then you can use your trackball to scroll backwards and forwards, because you might have had the perfect femur length in that time, but by the time you've hit the freeze button, the baby's in a different position. So you can use the scroll back on your ultrasound machine and get the good femur length or the heart in the good position where you want to look at the valves, and it really reduces your scan time. So the cine loop is an important function on your ultrasound machine, and I use it a lot, all the time. So now, how is the right way to scan? And how should you set up your room? So this is the way I think most people scan. The patient lies on a bed, and I scan with my right hand. I'm right-handed, so my ultrasound machine faces me. I look at the patient. We do have a monitor at the foot and end of the bed so that the patient doesn't have to turn her head, almost break her neck, to see the baby on the screen, but she can look straight in front of her and see the baby moving on the television screen. And then I use my left hand for the controls. So that is how most people scan. Here are the different ultrasound planes. There's a coronal plane, a sagittal plane, and a transverse plane. This, I think, is one of the most important aspects of this lecture, and that is your probe. So the next time you pick up your ultrasound probe, actually look at it. There's usually on the abdominal probe a groove, a dot, an indentation on the side of your probe, and that correlates with a dot on your ultrasound machine. So when you hold that probe in your hand, then that dot and the dot on the screen in front of you need to be on the same side. So you must check that when you start scanning, because when the patient is lying on the bed next to you, then the mother's right is on the left of your screen. So you put the probe down in a transverse section, and if your thumb and the dot on the screen are on the same side, take your finger and push there, and you will see the movement come in on the side of your machine. So what I find happens when people are learning to scan is they're looking for structures that are moving there, and they turn that probe around in the hand. They turn it more than 100 degrees, and suddenly everything is switched around. So when you move with your hand one way, something else happens on the screen on the other side. So here, the probe has now been turned incorrectly through 180 degrees, and suddenly when you push down on the maternal right, you see it moving on the right of your screen, which is not right. The same for the longitudinal orientation. When the probe is in a longitudinal way, then the maternal bladder should be on the right of your screen and her head on the left. So if you push down, then you will see touch the baby's head. And the problem with turning the probe around is that you can create a breech position when actually the baby is cephalic. For transvaginal scanning, you can see the thumb on the top dot of the machine. Look for that. And when you want to, that's for sagittal scanning, and when you want to do transverse section, you need to rotate the probe anti-clockwise. So here, the probe is inserted in a longitudinal section. Your thumb is to the top, and it correlates with the dot on the top of the screen. So that is the cephalid side of the mother, and that is a sagittal section. To get a transverse section, you need to rotate the probe anti-clockwise. And then right will be on the left of your screen, and left will be on the right of your screen. This sounds really silly, but every time I scan a patient, I always enter the patient's name, identification number, my name, what kind of scan I'm going to be doing, the gestational age. I explain to the patient what I'm going to be doing. I also inform them of possibly finding something that's unexpected, like a cyst on the ovary. So they're coming for a viability scan, but you find a cyst on the ovary. That sometimes happens. And it is important, especially when you're doing things like nuchal translucency scanning, to obtain consent for the examination and the patients understand the purpose of the scan. Always select the correct probe for the gestational age and the maternal BMI. Be aware of the orientation of the image. You must be consistent. Rotate the probe anti-clockwise for changing from a longitudinal to a transverse section when you're scanning transvaginally, and play with those buttons on your machine that we have discussed to obtain really good images. Good. Any questions? Any questions from the floor?
Well, I must say that this is a very important lecture because we take a lot of things for granted, but it is essential that you know to use correctly your machine. It is like having a very big and smart and expensive car and not being able to take the best out of it. So it's really essential. Question.
No, I'll be.
It's a bit like an ultrasound probe. Just wanted to ask, so our machines in the state usually has one curvilinear abdominal probe and a vaginal. How do you change the frequency on the probe if you want the best image then? Can you, or is it a standard probe? So you just have to do, or is there a button that you...
Yeah, so the curvy linear probes that you're referring for, they are 3 to 5 megahertz probes. As the multi-frequency probes, those big, heavy, also the volume probes, if it's a multi-frequency, there is a button on your machine, and you have to ask the ultrasound company's technician, where is the button for that machine? Because every company calls that button something else. Don't know if you want to add, Lut? They do. They do. Yeah, they do. Yeah, Lut?
So sometimes you can't choose the exact frequency on the machine, but the companies usually allow you a choice. Either you're doing sort of standard imaging, or you push the button to choose penetration, then they give you the lowest frequency they can, or you choose detail or resolution, and then they automatically give you the highest frequency on your probe. So you may not see the numbers of the exact frequency, but they choose the best the probe can give you for the two different conditions if it's not standard coverage.
I think most time it says penetration. Most time it says penetration, then you get to the lower frequency, so you get a better image.
No, lower frequency does not give a better image. It just allows you to see better in the very obese patient, where the baby is miles away from you. But in the lean patient, where the baby is close, you must scan with the setting resolution, because your picture will be far, far better. All right, so you really have to choose that button depending on who's lying on the bed right in front of you.
Great. Thanks, Shannon. It was great. What I teach our fellows in Johannesburg is always start with the low magnification, because you need to see where is the baby and orientate yourself, so orientation, then magnification, and then gain. So that's the triad that you need to, I think, take home. Orientation, magnification, gain. Because you need to see where is the baby lying and all that, get the idea, then magnify it, zoom out the area where you want to be with your depth and your zoom button, and then you will have to adjust your gain to make it darker as you saw in the picture there. Yeah. So orientation, magnification, gain. I think these are the principles that always work when you do basic scanning.
And I would also add focus.
Absolutely.
Because focus is also very important. It makes a huge difference if you, for instance, as Shannon showed, want to have a look at the lip of the baby, and your focus is high. By lowering the focus at the level of, below the level of the structure that you want to investigate, you will get much better view, much better images.